"Get the hell off our training ground, old man." Rock said it like that, in front of hundreds of Marine soldiers, laughing as he shoved the shoulder of a gray-haired veteran, as if he were clearing trash off his stage. In his eyes, that was nothing more than a relic of a bygone era, a corpse of the past clinging to faded glory, and the entire training ground laughed along with him. But just a few seconds later, with a single squeeze of the trigger, every laugh died in its throat. At a distance of 4,000 meters, the steel target trembled. The data appeared instantly on the screen. The space froze. The orange rifle they had mocked as a joke turned out to be evidence. Evidence of fraud, of polished numbers, of a system that survived on silence. That man was not out of date. He was Elijah Cole, a sniper legend, a man even the general had to salute with respect. If you were Rock, would you keep mocking, or would you bow your head? If you were standing in that crowd, would you stay silent to protect yourself, or dare to look straight at the truth? Watch until the end, and if you do not want to become part of that silence, hit subscribe to the channel, follow, and leave a comment, because these stories are not for those who prefer to look away. At the end of the year, the special training ground of the United States Marine Corps was filled not only with the sharp scent of gunpowder, but also with another lingering odor, the smell of sweat mixed with the hunger for advancement. For many young soldiers, this was not merely a training course, it was a gateway to promotion, to positions few could ever reach, to a new tier of power, where mistakes did not always demand a price. People crowded tightly around the firing range, some lowering their heads to clean their rifles and read the wind, others leaning against ammunition crates, laughing and chatting as if they were standing before a performance whose ending had already been arranged. Amid that crowd, Rock stood out not for his focus but for his noise. He was a white, non-commissioned officer with a solid build and eyes that constantly carried a confidence bordering on contempt. Rock was not a bad shot, everyone knew that, but what truly set him apart was his absolute sense of security. He knew he had people backing him, knew that any mistakes he made would be brushed aside like dust on a boot. In previous training sessions, he often stood among the soldiers, speaking loudly enough for many to hear, his voice laced with bragging and provocation. "Here, even if I miss, I still pass," Rock had once said, pounding his chest and laughing loudly, presenting it as a joke that everyone understood was true. He went on without lowering his voice, his eyes flicking briefly toward the officer in charge, standing not far away. "Rules exist for me to step over." That statement drew no reaction. The soldiers burst out laughing, a few nudged each other, treating the upcoming evaluation as a mere formality. In that atmosphere, rules seemed to become decorative, something that existed to be mentioned, not to be respected. A young soldier, still new, his voice tinged with hesitation, leaned toward the man beside him and whispered, "What if you mess up?" Rock heard it. He turned his head, shot a sideways glance, his smile twisting into a sneer. "If I mess up, someone else cleans it up." The answer fell lightly, like reassurance, yet heavy, like a declaration. A few people fell silent, others laughed along, as if already accustomed to how the world worked here. The officer in charge was clearly close enough to hear, but he merely shifted slightly, pretending to adjust the folder in his hands, avoiding the eyes of those around him. That silence, whether accidental or deliberate, made Rock's words seem legitimate. The air of the training ground thickened with a kind of arrogance that was hard to name. It did not explode into shouting. Instead, it seeped through every sentence, every glance, every dismissive shrug. For people like Rock, this training ground was not a place of testing, but a stepping stone toward the next set of privileges. At that moment, on the edge of the firing range, a figure appeared. At first, no one noticed. Among the crowd of young soldiers, the man looked out of place. He was significantly older, his pace slow, his back slightly stooped, his steps landing on the concrete, as if he were accustomed to measuring every distance. When he took a few more steps forward, the sunlight hit his shoulder directly, revealing something that made a few heads turn. A rifle was painted a vivid orange, on a training ground where everything was gray, green, or black. That orange color was so glaring it was almost an assault on the eyes. Murmurs began to spread, soft at first, then clearer. "What the hell is that? Who is this old guy?" Rock turned around. His gaze stopped on the rifle before settling on the man carrying it. He burst out laughing, making no effort to hide his contempt. "Hey, old man, Halloween is over. Take your toy somewhere else." Another soldier chimed in, his voice dripping with mockery. "Or do you think this is a deer hunting zone? That orange gun looks stupid as hell." The remarks came easily, nurtured by the sense of safety that power provided. The man remained still, his hand resting on the body of the rifle. His eyes were not on Rock but fixed straight ahead on the firing range, where steel targets stood silently at a great distance. That calm only made the laughter louder, as if his silence were an admission of the insults hurled at him. The officer in charge stepped forward, his voice carrying an official tone and a familiar excuse. For safety reasons, you are not permitted to be here. Please leave the training ground. Rock took another step forward, close enough to clearly see the stiff wrinkles on the man's face. He lowered his head slightly, his voice thick with provocation. Didn't you hear? Or are your ears too old? Get out before I call security. The soldiers behind him fell silent for a moment, waiting to see what would happen. They expected an argument, confusion, or at least some sign that the man understood where he was, but he stayed where he was. His gaze sank inward, as if he were looking through the men in front of him, through the training ground itself, back to another place, one where a missed shot was not just a low score, but the loss of an entire team's life. That silence irritated Rock. He was used to getting reactions, used to his words provoking fear or submission. Receiving nothing in return made him feel challenged. He raised his hand, shoved the man hard in the shoulder, then yanked the rifle from his grip. Get the hell off our firing range, Rock growled, his voice dropping lower. This isn't a place for washed-up old men. The orange rifle nearly slipped from Rock's hands as he jerked it away, but he managed to keep hold of it, sneering as if he had just won a small game. The soldiers laughed along, a few clapped half-heartedly. In that brief scuffle, a technical non-commissioned officer standing nearby froze. His eyes did not linger on the argument, but on the rifle. Though old, every detail of it had been maintained with an almost obsessive precision. There were no unnecessary scratches, no loose components. The man stood slightly off the wind, yet his body unconsciously adjusted its posture, like a reflex honed over countless years, and the orange color was not the paint chosen for fun. Rock did not notice any of that. All he saw was the crowd behind him, the silence of the officer in charge, the reinforcement of his own authority. He laughed louder, raised the rifle like a trophy, then tossed it back toward the man. All eyes now converged on the vivid orange rifle resting on the stranger's shoulder, an object that did not belong in this place, yet somehow caused the entire training ground to slow. As if holding a single breath, the elderly man remained standing at the edge of the shooting range, where the slanting sunlight made the orange color of the firearm appear even more out of place. In a space accustomed to gray, blue, and black, the orange stood out like a cut, causing discomfort in many eyes. His presence was judged in a very simple way: someone who did not belong here, an anomaly that needed to be removed. Whispers spread quickly, passing from one group to another, forming a background layer of sound heavy with mockery. "What the hell is that?" a voice burst out, making no effort to hide its irritation. Someone else tilted his head for a closer look, curling his lips into a sneer. Who is this old man? Those questions did not require answers. They existed to reinforce the shared feeling that the man had no right to stand there. Rock sensed this clearly. He turned fully around, staring straight at the man, his eyes lighting up as he found a target for his familiar arrogance. He burst into loud laughter, rough and echoing, loud enough to draw even more attention. "Halloween is over, old man," Rock said, dragging out the final word to emphasize the mockery. He raised his hand and pointed directly at the firearm, not attempting to hide his contempt. "Take your toy somewhere else." As soon as the words fell, a few more laughs rang out. A young soldier standing nearby joined in eagerly. "Looks stupid as hell." Those words were thrown out easily, like small stones, but one after another, enough to make anyone hesitate. In that moment, the training ground was no longer a place for instruction. It turned into a stage of ridicule, where one person was placed at the center to serve as entertainment for the crowd. The man remained still, his hand firmly gripping the body of the firearm, his gaze unwavering. That calmness, instead of silencing the laughter, made it grow louder. The officer in charge stepped forward, keeping just enough distance to avoid confrontation. His voice was proper, cold, and dry. "For safety reasons, you must leave the range." The phrasing was familiar and procedural, as if this were merely a small matter to be handled quickly. Rock heard it, and the smile on his face widened. He stepped closer, shortening the distance between himself and the man. His voice dropped lower, but the provocation became clearer. "Are you deaf with old age?" The question hung in the air. The soldiers behind him fell silent for a beat, waiting to see the reaction. The man did not answer. He stood there, his gaze sinking, as if looking past Rock. past the range, toward memories that did not belong to this place. The silence lasted long enough to make some people uncomfortable. To Rock, it was a sign of defiance. He tilted his head, studying the man's face lined with time, then laughed again. Or do you not understand human language? There was no response. The man maintained his posture. The crowd behind began to murmur again. A few people turned to look at the officer in charge, waiting for a more decisive action. But the officer merely stood there, his eyes drifting away, as if everything happening had nothing to do with his responsibility. The silence from authority made the insults feel legitimate. Rock realized this quickly. He reached out and gave the man's shoulder a light shove, just enough to assert dominance. "Didn't you hear?" he said, his voice rougher. "Get lost before I call security." The shove was not strong, but it was loaded with meaning. It was a declaration that here, Rock had the authority to decide who could stay and who had to go. The man leaned slightly with the force, then straightened again. That composure made Rock frown. He was not used to being ignored. He was used to reactions, to fearful or angry looks. Getting nothing in return made him feel his power was being challenged. He reached out and yanked the firearm off the man's shoulder. The motion was fast and crude. "Get the hell off our range," Rock said, his voice dropping. "This isn't a place for failed old men." The firearm ended up in Rock's hands. He lifted it, gave it a cursory look, then sneered. The bright orange under the sunlight made him squint in irritation. He rotated the firearm once, as if examining a worthless object. The soldiers behind burst into loud laughter, with a few mocking whistles cutting through the air. In that moment, a technical non-commissioned officer standing near the range noticed a detail others overlooked. His eyes lingered on the body of the firearm, on the joints, on the neatness of each component. The firearm looked old, but not careless. Every detail was kept in perfect condition, as if it had gone through countless rigorous inspections. The man stood slightly downwind, yet his body adjusted naturally, a reflex requiring no thought. Rock did not notice any of that. He only saw the crowd on his side, the silence of the officer in charge, the authority reinforced by every laugh. He raised the firearm high like a trophy, then threw it back toward the man. The firearm was caught cleanly, without a single wasted movement. The man's silence stretched on for another beat. The crowd waited. Rock waited, as if everyone wanted to see the moment he would collapse or walk away. But he remained standing. That calm made Rock feel his irritation rise sharply. He clenched his jaw, his eyes darkening. At this point, the insult had gone beyond words. It became a confrontation, even though only one side was shouting, and it was that silence, heavy and unsettling, that began to truly enrage Rock. The man remained standing in the middle of the training ground, where laughter and stares poured onto him like a tangible pressure. Rock realized that this silence was unlike anything he had seen before. It did not carry fear, nor was it the familiar resignation. It made him uncomfortable because it did not give him an immediate sense of victory. In the world Rock was accustomed to, power had to be confirmed by the reaction of others. Here, that reaction did not appear. "Get the hell off our firing range," Rock growled, his voice dropping low, heavy, sharp. He stepped forward and shoved the man hard in the shoulder in front of the crowd. The shove was rough enough to make each side's position clear, rough enough for everyone around to understand that this was no longer a joke. The man tilted slightly with the force, then returned to his original position. The movement was clean, with no excess, causing a few gazes to linger longer. Rock frowned. He reached out and yanked the orange-colored gun from the man's shoulder. A familiar motion, as if he were stripping away an object that never belonged to its owner. The gun left the man's hand and fell into Rock's grasp amid the murmurs of the soldiers. A few laughs burst out, loud and crude, reflecting the excitement of the one holding the advantage. The soldiers laughed louder when they saw the man still silent. Some glanced at one another, shrugged, treating the scene as extended entertainment. That silence, in their eyes, confirmed the mockery. But to a technical, non-commissioned officer standing nearby, the feeling was different. He did not laugh, his gaze fixed on the gun in Rock's hand. The gun looked old, its surface, not polished, yet every small detail was in perfect condition. No unnecessary cracks, no signs of looseness. The components fit together with an almost obsessive precision. The man standing there, though shoved, had maintained his balance, his body naturally adjusting with the wind. That was not the reflex of a beginner, but a habit forged over a long period of time. The orange color on the gun's body was also unlike ordinary decorative paint. It adhered firmly, did not peel, and did not fade under sunlight. The technical non-commissioned officer recognized it as a technical coating, the kind used for very specific purposes. He narrowed his eyes slightly as unease crept into his thoughts. Rock paid no attention. He rotated the gun in his hand, sneering, as if holding a misplaced object. "Why don't you try shooting?" he said, his tone laced with challenge. The sentence brought the range to silence for a beat. The soldiers behind him stopped laughing, their eyes turning toward the man. The officer in charge stood a few steps away, maintaining a neutral expression, not intervening. The silence from authority made Rock's challenge public and legitimate. The man looked at Rock, his gaze deep and heavy, as if weighing not words, but the consequences of every action. He did not answer immediately. That slowness made Rock feel ignored yet again. He ground his teeth, tightening his grip on the gun. "Did you hear me?" Rock said louder, for the whole range to hear. "Or are you scared now?" A few awkward laughs sounded, but no longer in unison. The atmosphere began to change, slowly and subtly, yet enough for the perceptive to feel it. The man reached out and took the gun back from Rock. The motion was calm and firm. The gun returned to its original position, on his shoulder, as if it had never been taken. Rock stepped back half a step, his eyes darkening. He was not used to losing control of the rhythm of a confrontation. The crowd behind him began to murmur, some whispering to one another. The technical non-commissioned officer remained still, his eyes never leaving the orange gun. The man stepped forward, one step, just enough to stand within everyone's view. He said nothing, but his posture shifted ever so slightly. His shoulders lowered, his feet reset. Anyone who had undergone serious training recognized it as a preparatory stance. No show, no theatrics, just pure readiness. Rock noticed the change in the crowd's gaze. He narrowed his eyes, forcing a sneer. "Don't make me laugh," he said. "Do you even know where you are?" The question needed no answer. The man stared straight toward the firing range, where steel targets stood motionless at a distant range. Sunlight reflected faintly off the orange gun, making it stand out even more. A strange sensation spread through the crowd, as if they were standing before a moment no one fully understood. The technical non-commissioned officer stepped forward half a step, then stopped. He said nothing, but his expression had shifted from curiosity to caution. He realized he was witnessing something beyond an ordinary humiliation. Rock took a deep breath, then laughed loudly, trying to pull the attention back to himself. "Fine," he said, his voice ringing out. "If you want to shoot, I'll let you shoot." The words echoed clearly, bouncing off the surrounding concrete walls. The soldiers stirred, some turning to look at one another, excitement mixed with curiosity. The officer in charge still did not intervene. His silence now resembled a tacit nod. Rock spread his arms, his voice rising. "The rules are simple. I shoot first. You go after. Whoever loses kneels." The challenge was thrown out openly, without concealment, without retreat. The range, for a moment, held its breath. The man stood there, his eyes never leaving the targets. His silence now carried a different meaning, heavier, deeper. "Do you think this silence is fear, or something that has been killed on the battlefield?" Rock turned around and raised his hand to signal readiness. His voice rang out one last time, full of certainty. "Begin." And at that moment, before the eyes of the entire range, Rock openly issued the challenge, pushing everything beyond the boundary of humiliation and opening an irreversible confrontation. Rock's challenge rang out across the training ground, like an order rather than a proposal. The atmosphere around them shifted instantly, from curiosity to excitement, from hushed murmurs to tense anticipation. For Rock, this was no longer about driving off someone who did not belong. This was an opportunity to reassert his position before the crowd, to prove that the power he held was not something silence could undermine. Rock stepped into the middle of the firing range, spreading his arms like a host accustomed to the audience's gaze. His voice rang loud and decisive. "Whoever loses kneels." He paused for a beat, swept his eyes across the training ground, then continued, each word sharply emphasized. In front of everyone, there was no objection. No one spoke up to mention regulations, to bring up limits, or to question the legitimacy of this game. A few people glanced toward the officer in charge, waiting for some sign of intervention. But the man remained still, his gaze evasive, as if what was happening lay outside the scope of his responsibility. That silence became an unspoken acceptance of Rock's rules. The soldiers began to cheer. Some whistled, others clapped, treating the scene before them like a public humiliation whose ending had already been written. To them, the older man was merely a supporting role, a character meant to frame Rock's victory. The excitement spread quickly, smothering the faint unease that had just begun to surface at the edges of the crowd. Rock took the first firing position. He gave his weapon a quick check, the movements familiar and confident. His eyes swept over the target at standard distance, a range he had fired at hundreds of times before. To him, this was home ground. He knew the wind, knew the distance, knew the margin of error the system allowed. He raised the rifle, adjusted his stance, steadied his breathing, then pulled the trigger. The shot cracked cleanly. The bullet streaked forward and struck the steel target near the center. The scoring system responded immediately. The result was good enough to impress, safe enough to avoid any surprise. Rock lowered the rifle, turned back toward the crowd, and bared his teeth in a grin. "That's how you shoot," he said, his voice thick with self-satisfaction. Laughter rolled through the crowd like a wave. A few people nudged each other, whispering mocking remarks aimed at the older man waiting for his turn. In their eyes, the distance between the two had widened another step. Rock had done exactly what he needed to do. The rest was just a ceremony. The older man stepped up to the firing position. The crowd fell quiet for a moment, not out of respect, but out of curiosity. He moved slowly, each step landing evenly on the concrete, as though he were measuring distance by feel rather than sight. When he reached the line, he stopped, removed the orange-colored rifle from his shoulder, and placed it on the shooting table. That action drew a few bursts of laughter. Some shook their heads, assuming he was trying to stall for time, but those standing close could see clearly that the way he set the rifle down was precise, neither crooked nor forceful. He drew in a slow, deep breath, then let it out gently. The motion carried no sign of tension, nor did it resemble any kind of showy preparation. It looked like a habit repeated too many times to require thought. Rock stood off to the side, arms crossed over his chest, his eyes never leaving the older man. He narrowed his gaze, his smile still fixed in place, but something in his look had changed. Absolute confidence gave way to a feeling he could not quite name. He did not like this rhythm. He was used to things moving fast, decisively, with clear reactions from his opponent. Here, the older man's unhurried pace was testing his patience. The soldiers behind them continued to chatter. Some made small bets, others shook their heads, convinced the outcome was already obvious. But a few eyes began to look more closely, noticing the way the older man stood, the way he placed his feet, the focus that was directed not at the crowd but straight down range. A technical, non-commissioned officer nearby followed every movement, a growing sense of unease settling in his gut. The older man lifted the rifle and snugged it against his shoulder. Sunlight reflected off the orange paint, highlighting every line of its form. He did not rush to adjust the scope. He stared straight ahead, as if confirming something in his mind. Rock let out a quiet laugh, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Do you even know what distance you're shooting at?" The older man did not respond. He held his position, his eyes never leaving the target. The silence stretched for another beat, and the crowd began to grow restless. A few awkward laughs sounded, but they no longer carried the same certainty as before. Then the older man spoke, his voice low and clear, audible to those standing close. He did not talk about results. He did not mention winning or losing. He made only a single request. "I want to change the distance." The words brought the training ground to a halt. Rock snapped his head around, the smile on his face stiffening. "Change the distance?" he asked, irritation mixed with surprise. "You think this is a joke?" The older man kept his gaze fixed downrange. He continued, his voice even. "This distance isn't enough." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. The soldiers looked at one another, then toward the target set farther away. To them, changing the distance in a challenge that had already been set was absurd. Rock burst out laughing, but this time it sounded forced. "How far do you want?" he asked. The older man did not answer right away. He raised his hand and gestured toward the far end of the range, where steel targets at distances well beyond standard training stood silent, nearly forgotten in routine evaluations. That single gesture made the air around the training ground turn cold for a beat. Rock froze, the crowd held its breath, and in that moment, when the older man demanded a distance far beyond standard training parameters, the rules of the game Rock had set began to crack in a way no one had anticipated. The newly established distance cast the entire training ground into a strange state. The steel targets at a distance of 4,000 meters, which had long been nearly forgotten, and used only for special, experimental drills or technical research, now became the focus of every gaze. At that distance, the target no longer had a clear shape. It was merely a blurred dot blending into the distant terrain, where wind, temperature, and the curvature of the bullet's trajectory could shatter the confidence of any shooter. Rock followed the direction the man pointed, then burst out laughing. The laughter rang out awkwardly, yet he still tried to maintain his familiar arrogance. "You're insane," he said, turning to the soldiers, as if seeking agreement. A few laughs answered back, but they were no longer as confident as before. 4,000 meters was not a number to joke about. Even the best shooters in the unit rarely reached that distance in ordinary training. The man did not look at Rock. He stood still at the firing position, his gaze fixed straight ahead, where the target was now only a faint marker. He adjusted his stance, each small movement slow and precise. Amid the murmuring sounds and skeptical stares, he whispered, his voice low enough that only those standing nearby could hear, "Distance does not kill people." The sentence drifted across the training ground like a cold wind. It was not a rebuttal, nor was it a boast. It sounded like a conclusion drawn from experiences no one here wanted to hear retold. Rock frowned, about to say something, but then fell silent. His confidence now had to give way to a sense of discomfort, as everything was no longer unfolding according to the familiar script. The man pressed his cheek against the rifle stock, his eyes focused through the scope. At this distance, aiming was no longer about seeing the target clearly. It was a combination of calculation, intuition, and experience accumulated over many years. The wind blew lightly from the right, carrying unpredictable fluctuations. The temperature near the ground differed from the air above. Every factor demanded absolute precision. He pulled the trigger. The shot rang out no differently from the previous ones, but the feeling it left behind was entirely different. The sharp, dry sound cut through the air, then dissolved into the vast emptiness ahead. After the shot, everything fell silent. Not the silence imposed by regulation, but a natural silence, as hundreds of people held their breath together. A few seconds passed, stretching until they felt heavy. Some people began to tilt their heads, trying to look toward the steel target, but at that distance, the naked eye could not distinguish anything. Rock crossed his arms, the sneer returning to his face, as if certain this was nothing more than a meaningless act of recklessness. Then the steel target trembled. The metallic sound echoed faintly, yet clearly enough to pierce the silence enveloping the training ground. The vibration was transmitted back through the sensor system, and almost immediately, data appeared on the real-time display screen. The figure flickered, then settled into an unmistakable position. A hit. The entire training ground was stunned. No one spoke, no one laughed, no one reacted in time. That moment was like a direct blow to the perception of everyone present. 4,000 meters was no longer a number on paper. It had just been proven by a single shot. Rock spun around to stare at the screen, then looked back toward the steel target, his eyes wide open. The confidence on his face shattered, revealing panic he could not hide in time. "Cheating," he screamed, his voice sharp and shrill, as if shouting enough could make that truth disappear. "That's impossible. He's a fraud." His voice rang harshly through the silence. A few people glanced at one another, awkward and unsure how to react. Someone tried to laugh out of habit, but the laughter died halfway. The result on the screen did not allow anyone to treat this as a matter of luck. The data was displayed clearly, coldly, without emotion. The man lowered his rifle, his movements calm. He did not look at Rock, nor did he look at the crowd. His gaze lingered toward the distance for one more beat, then returned to the firing position. To him, the shot just taken was not a performance. It was a necessary action, carried out at the right moment. Rock continued shouting, stepping closer and pointing at the man. "You all see that no way could happen," he said, turning to the soldiers as if seeking support. But the eyes that met his were no longer certain. The arrogance that once made him the center of attention was now beginning to backfire. Among the crowd, the technical non-commissioned officer stood motionless. He did not look at Rock. His eyes were locked onto the data panel, where the parameters were displayed in far greater detail than what the crowd was paying attention to. Deviation, trajectory, response time, everything lay within limits that no manual interference could conceal. The unease inside him turned into a clear realization. This shot did not merely hit the target. It had struck something else, something deeper, more dangerous. The figures on the screen did not tell only the story of a bullet. They told of the difference between what had been reported and what had just happened before everyone's eyes. In that moment, the technical non-commissioned officer understood that he was witnessing something this system had tried to avoid for many years. Rock was still yelling, but his voice was gradually swallowed by the surrounding silence. The soldiers no longer laughed. The officer in charge stood rigid, his eyes shifting between the screen and the man. No one made a decision. No one spoke to reassure anyone else. Everything seemed frozen by a shot that did not belong in a performance. The technical non-commissioned officer took a deep breath. He knew he was standing at a boundary. On one side was the familiar safety of silence. On the other was the naked truth that had just revealed itself. He did not turn toward Rock. He did not look at the crowd. His eyes remained fixed on the data panel, where the figures continued to display calm, indifferent, and unyielding. And in that very moment, as every gaze wavered between disbelief and fear, the technical non-commissioned officer understood that this could not end here. After the shot, the training range did not erupt the way Rock had always been used to. There were no cheers, no thunderous shouts of praise. The atmosphere froze, thick and congealed, as if every sound had just been drained out of the space. The data screen was still lit, the figures displayed with an almost irritating clarity, existing there like a truth that required no one's permission. The technical non-commissioned officer standing near the control panel was the first to break the silence. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "This data doesn't match the report." The sentence was short, but its weight spread faster than any shouted command. A few pairs of eyes turned toward him. Others immediately looked down at the ground, as if unwilling to get involved. Rock snapped his head around, his face flushing red. He took a step forward, pointed straight at the technical non-commissioned officer, and barked sharply. "Shut up." The shout rang out harshly, an attempt to seize back control through sheer volume. But this time, it did not work as it once had, because the numbers on the screen were still there. They did not react, did not change, did not know fear. They existed beyond the reach of manipulation by words. An older man stood not far away. He studied the figures, his gaze steady and focused, as if he were reading a familiar language. When he spoke, his voice was neither loud nor heavy, but it was clear enough to cut through the chaos just beginning to form. "This is not an individual error." Rock turned toward him, eyes blazing with anger. "You shut your mouth," he growled, but the man did not look at Rock. He continued staring at the data panel, where small but repeated deviations appeared, lining up into a pattern that could not be denied. "It is simulated training," the man went on, each word delivered slowly. An officer standing behind them instinctively turned his face away. The movement was small, but it did not hide anything. He knew he had just heard something that should not be said here, at least not in front of so many people. A few others shifted their weight, visibly unsettled. The silence began to take on a different tone, no longer indifferent, but evasive. The man continued, his voice even, without accusation or attack. "In real combat, they die." The final 3 words fell onto the training range like a clean cut. No one objected. No one laughed. Rock's earlier remarks, his boasts about passing even with missed shots, suddenly became naked and terrifying, because if what had just happened was real, then those beautiful numbers in the reports were no longer achievements, but lies wrapped in formality. The technical non-commissioned officer swallowed hard. He looked back at the data panel, then over at the training records stored in the system. The discrepancy became clearer when placed side by side. Recent classes showed abnormally consistent results. Error margins were lower than what could realistically be achieved under real conditions. Shot groupings were too perfect, too clean. Everything looked as if it had been polished to fit expectations, rather than to reflect reality. Several officers began exchanging glances. No words were needed. They understood one another well enough to know that this problem was not new. It had existed quietly, concealed beneath convenience and shared interests. Keeping the numbers attractive meant keeping careers safe. Staying silent meant not becoming a troublemaker. Rock sensed the shift in the air. He was no longer at the center of attention in the way he wanted. Eyes were no longer turned toward him in expectation of direction, but past him, toward the screen, toward the silent man standing there. He forced an awkward laugh, trying to salvage the situation. These numbers could be wrong. Equipment malfunctions happen. The man turned his head, looking directly at Rock for the first time. His gaze held no anger, no contempt. It was calm, but sharp. "Repeated deviations are not equipment errors," he said. "They are traces." No one interrupted him. The officer in charge stood rigid. He understood that from this moment on, every choice had become clearer and more dangerous. His earlier silence was no longer neutral. It was beginning to take the shape of complicity. The technical non-commissioned officer felt sweat soak into his back. He knew that what stood before him was not merely an exceptional shot. It was the intersection point of years of beautified data, of small decisions made for the sake of convenience, of repeated moments of looking away so as not to disturb the existing order. Fraud here did not require a grand conspiracy. It existed through authority and collective silence. Another officer spoke up, his voice cautious. "Maybe we should handle this internally." The words drifted into the air, met with no response. The man looked over, nodded very slightly, acknowledging the existence of that thought, then said, "And how long has this been handled internally?" No one answered, because everyone knew the answer. The atmosphere on the training range was now heavier than it had ever been before. The soldiers standing farther away began to sense that they were witnessing something beyond a simple challenge. The small murmurs faded, then disappeared entirely. The truth, once exposed, did not need noise to assert its presence. The man turned back to the data screen once more. "Recent classes have not been trained according to real conditions," he said. "Some people used their authority to commit fraud. Many others knew, but chose silence to protect their careers and the unit's reputation." No one argued. Those words did not accuse any single individual, but that was precisely what made them dangerous, because they did not target one person, but an entire system. The technical non-commissioned officer stood still for a few seconds, then reached toward the control panel and saved all the data. The movement was small, but decisive. He knew he was crossing a line. Behind him, Rock still stood there, lips pressed tight, his expression wavering between anger and fear. If you were there, would you continue to remain silent, or would you dare to face the truth? The technical non-commissioned officer said nothing more, while everyone else remained held in place by the numbers on the screen and thoughts not yet fully formed. He quietly sent the report up to the highest level of command. Somewhere deep within a system long accustomed to smooth, artificial order, a critical point had just been touched. Not long after the report was sent, the familiar rhythm of the training ground was abruptly and brutally interrupted. The low murmur of conversations faded away when a heavy, rumbling sound of military vehicle engines echoed from the main gate. This was not the kind of vehicle that regularly appeared during training sessions or routine inspections. The sound carried a different cadence, decisive, cold, like a warning signal that whatever was about to enter did not belong to the safe routine they had long relied on. The soldiers turned their heads in unison. Half-finished conversations stopped mid-sentence. There was a soft clink of metal as a few people unconsciously set their rifles down. The engine roared once more, then cut off completely. The air seemed to compress inside everyone's chest. This silence was no longer indifference or avoidance. It was instinct. Rock stood near the firing position, his eyes locked on the gate. He swallowed hard, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Who called in this level? No one answered. The question did not need an answer. If this convoy had arrived, it meant something had gone beyond internal handling. Rock felt that clearly, even though he did not want to admit it. The familiar sense of safety, the thing that had followed him for years, began to crack. The door of the first vehicle opened. A senior officer stepped out, his eyes sweeping across the training ground out of habit. Then the second door opened. The man who stepped down moved slowly, his posture straight, each step landing firmly on the concrete. On his shoulder rested the rank of Brigadier General. He needed no introduction. His presence alone was a declaration. Brigadier General Marcus paused for a moment, letting his gaze take in the entire training ground. He did not look at Rock. He did not look at the soldiers standing rigid, his eyes fixed on a single point, the place where the older man with the orange rifle was standing. Elijah Cole. Marcus walked toward him, leaving behind a pocket of stillness. The officers accompanying him automatically spread out, keeping their distance. Rock stood frozen, a chill running down his spine. He realized that he was no longer at the center of the frame, and that was a completely unfamiliar feeling. Brigadier General Marcus stopped in front of the man. He raised his hand, the motion crisp and precise, a formal military salute. Not a casual courtesy, but respect given to someone equal in worth, even if not equal in rank on paper. The entire training ground went dead silent. Not a whisper, not a heavy breath. The soldiers stood as if turned to stone, eyes wide. The officer in charge felt his throat go dry. He understood all too well the meaning of such a salute, especially when performed openly, in front of hundreds of people. Marcus lowered his hand, his voice deep and clear, loud enough for the entire training ground to hear. "Greetings, Elijah Cole." The name struck like a direct blow to the awareness of many. An officer standing nearby blurted out, unable to hide his shock. "The sniper legend." The words spread faster than the engine noise had moments before. Elijah Cole, a name that required no title, no lengthy explanation. For those who had studied modern sniper doctrine, who had read advanced training materials, it was a name tied to foundations, to standards written in experience and blood. Rock stood rigid, his face drained of color, his lips pressed tight. The words he had shouted earlier, the mocking laughter, the shove to the shoulder, all of it flooded back into his mind at once. He wanted to say something, to react, but no words would come. The power he had leaned on suddenly felt laughably fragile. Elijah stood straight, receiving Marcus's salute with unchanged calm. He did not return it with an equal gesture. He merely nodded slightly. To him, ceremony was not something to display. It was a mutual acknowledgement between people who understood the value of real combat better than anyone. Marcus turned back toward the training ground, his gaze sweeping across the motionless faces. He said nothing further for the moment. His presence alone was enough to sever every minor dispute. A few mid-level officers exchanged glances, realizing that from this moment on, decisions would no longer rest in their hands. The soldiers began to whisper very softly, then fell silent again on their own. They sensed that this was no longer a training session, nor a challenge. The atmosphere shifted into something else more serious, heavier. Conversations about promotion, scores, and privileges suddenly felt out of place. Rock took a step back without even realizing it. He looked at Elijah, then at Marcus, then back at the crowd. He understood that he had just lost the greatest weapon that had ever kept him standing, his invisible backing. In front of a brigadier general and a name like Elijah Cole, every word he had ever relied on became hollow. The officer in charge felt cold sweat run down his back. He understood that his earlier silence had now been seen, not through accusing eyes, but through the undeniable presence of a higher authority. Every avoided decision, every act of looking the other way, was beginning to take shape. Marcus turned back toward Elijah, his voice lowered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I've received the report," he said. "We need to talk." Elijah nodded. He glanced once more across the training ground, where mocking laughter had echoed only minutes before. Now, there was nothing but tense silence. He understood that this moment was not merely the revelation of an identity. It was a turning point. The identity of Elijah Cole was revealed publicly, before the entire training ground. No introduction board, no lengthy explanation required. That name, together with the salute just given, was enough to overturn the balance of power in a single breath. And somewhere in Rock's eyes, in the unconscious lowering of a few officers' heads, in the heavy silence of the soldiers, a new understanding was forming. What had begun with an orange rifle and a shot at an unimaginable distance had now gone far beyond the scope of a challenge. The training ground still stood there, but the power within it had changed hands. The office door closed behind them, cutting off every remaining sound from the training ground. Outside, curious looks, whispers, and speculation were still spreading. Inside, the space narrowed, leaving only two people and one thing that could not be ignored. Brigadier General Marcus stood with his back to the door for a few seconds, as if to make sure no one else would enter. When he turned around, his expression had changed. It was no longer the presence of a commanding officer before a crowd, but the weight of responsibility. "Speak," Marcus said, his voice low and clipped. Elijah did not answer immediately. He stepped toward the large table in the center of the room and slowly placed the orange rifle onto the wooden surface. The soft sound of metal touching the table rang clearly in the quiet room. The rifle lay there, no longer the object that had stirred commotion on the range, but a fixed point around which the entire room was forced to revolve. "You reported it incorrectly," Elijah said evenly, neither accusatory nor evasive. Marcus frowned. He looked at the rifle, then at Elijah, as if weighing multiple layers of information at once. "Are you certain?" he asked, the question carrying both caution and a fragile hope that this might only be a misunderstanding. Elijah did not reply right away. He reached out and opened a small device attached to the rifle. A screen lit up, connecting to an independent recording system. Lines of data began to scroll, then stopped, arranging themselves into stark columns of numbers. There were no flashy graphics, no lengthy explanations, just numbers. The margin of error appeared clearly, cold and unyielding. Marcus stepped closer. He bent down, his eyes scanning each line. The figures were not large, but they repeated themselves, consistent to a disturbing degree. He murmured, as if speaking to himself, "They do not match, truly." Elijah looked at Marcus, his eyes carrying no sense of victory. "For many years," he said slowly, as if each word bore the weight of time. The room sank into a heavy silence. Marcus rested his hands on the table and took a deep breath. He was accustomed to polished reports, accustomed to upward trending charts, accustomed to believing that the system he stood within operated smoothly. But what lay before him no longer allowed him to cling to that familiarity. "You came here because of this?" Marcus asked, his voice lower. "Not only because of this," Elijah replied, "because of its consequences." Marcus lifted his head. He understood very well that the statement in sniper training was not harmless. It was the distance between life and death, between a mission completed and a unit that did not return with everyone accounted for. He looked at the data again and realized that the discrepancy had not appeared once but had persisted across many training cycles. Elijah, Marcus said, using his name directly for the first time. If this is true, then responsibility does not rest with a single individual. Elijah gave a slight nod. I know. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment. In his mind, names, faces, and reports he had signed began to surface. He realized he could no longer place the blame on a technical error or a careless subordinate. These numbers existed because they had been accepted, overlooked, and deemed convenient. Elijah, Marcus continued, his voice growing hoarse. Do you know where this will lead? I do, Elijah answered, and I also know where it will lead if nothing is done. Marcus looked straight at him. In Elijah's eyes, there was no threat and no demand. There was only the cold resolve of someone who had seen the outcome before it arrived. The orange rifle on the table stood like a silent witness, saying nothing, yet carrying immense weight. Marcus walked around the table and stopped in front of the data screen. He touched the edge of the table, feeling the chill of its surface. This recording system, he asked, outside the chain of command. Completely, Elijah replied. No edits after training. No one can interfere. Marcus let out a soft laugh, but it was not one of relief. It was short and heavy. A perfect piece of evidence, he said. Not to be perfect, Elijah corrected. To be impossible to distort. The words silenced Marcus. He understood the difference well. Perfection could be displayed. Being impossible to distort was uncomfortable. He looked at the rifle again and understood why the color orange had been chosen. It did not blend into the background, did not allow confusion, and did not allow anyone to pretend not to see it. Marcus turned his back to the window and looked out toward the yard where the training ground lay still under the sunlight. Outside, everything remained the same, but inside this room, a crack had appeared. Elijah, he said quietly, if I continue down this path, many people will be pulled into it. Yes, Elijah replied, but if you do not, others will die. Marcus nodded slightly. He did not argue. He understood this was not a theoretical comparison. It was a choice between reputation and lives, between surface-level stability and the cost paid in the future. He returned to the table and placed his hand along the edge of the rifle. The 4,000-meter shot, he said, was not to prove that you could still shoot well. No, Elijah replied. It was to prove that those numbers were lying. Marcus looked at Elijah for a long time. In that moment, he realized he was no longer facing a veteran, seeking to reclaim old glory. He was facing someone who had waited for the right moment to place the truth on the table, in a way that could not be ignored. The air in the room thickened, heavy as stone. No one spoke further. Any words now would have been unnecessary. The numbers on the screen remained lit, neither flickering nor disappearing. They were there, waiting to be addressed, waiting for a decision. Marcus exhaled slowly. In his mind, the picture had become clearer. This was not the personal mistake of a non-commissioned officer, not the carelessness of a single training session. It was a mechanism that had operated for far too long in silence and convenience. He lifted his head and looked at Elijah, his voice dropping another notch. If this is an entire mechanism, Marcus said, then it cannot end in this room. Elijah nodded. I never thought it would end here. Marcus looked at the rifle one last time, then at the data screen. In his eyes, the final trace of hesitation gave way to clear recognition. What lay before him was no longer a report to be handled delicately, but a system that needed to be exposed. And in that very moment, Marcus understood that this was not the fault of one person, but of an entire mechanism that had existed long enough to be confident it would never be touched. The atmosphere in Brigadier General Marcus's office remained heavy, as if it had never been stirred. After the figures, after the tacit acknowledgement that this was not an individual mistake, another question began to emerge more clearly. Who had allowed this to exist for so long? Elijah stood beside the desk, the orange-colored gun still lying there, uncovered, not put away, as if its very presence forced everyone to continue facing the truth. Elijah lightly touched the body of the gun, his voice steady and low. The orange color makes it impossible to conceal. Marcus looked up. He looked at the gun, then at Elijah. Outside the chain of command, he asked, though in his mind he already nearly had the answer. Elijah nodded. It cannot be altered. The answer was brief and decisive. It cut off every possibility of soft interpretation that Marcus was accustomed to using when handling sensitive matters. This system existed to stand outside all habits of adjusting figures. It did not ask permission. It did not compromise. It recorded what happened, exactly as it happened, The office door opened. Several senior officers were summoned in, those directly involved in training and reporting. They entered cautiously, their eyes quickly stopping on the orange gun on the table. No one asked why it was there. They all had enough experience to understand that the presence of such an openly displayed piece of evidence was not accidental. Marcus did not offer a long introduction. He simply stated that there was a serious issue that needed clarification. Glances were exchanged quickly. An older officer cleared his throat softly, breaking the silence. "We can handle this internally," he said, his voice carrying the familiar tone of someone who had extinguished trouble many times by keeping it behind closed doors. Elijah turned to look at him. His gaze was neither sharp nor angry. It was so calm that it left the other man feeling hollow. "How long have you been handling it?" he asked. The question hung in the air. No one answered immediately. A few avoided Elijah's eyes and turned to Marcus as if seeking protection. The silence stretched another beat, long enough for the question to answer itself through their avoidance. Another officer spoke up, his voice tightening. "You're destroying other people's careers." The words rang out clearly, carrying restrained irritation. It was not merely an objection to Elijah, but the voice of an entire layer accustomed to relying on the outward stability of the system. Breaking it meant dragging along countless names, countless files, countless career paths already laid out. Elijah looked directly at the man who had spoken. His voice dropped, but every word carried weight. "You destroyed lives first." No one responded. That statement did not allow debate. It did not rely on emotion, nor did it require further illustration. The figures on the screen had said enough. The repeated discrepancies had said enough. The polished training records had said enough. Their previous silence now took shape more clearly than ever. Marcus leaned against the desk, his hand resting on the cold wooden surface. He listened, not interrupting, not intervening. In his mind, the pieces began to fit together. Reports that were too perfect, the results were too stable, the approvals he had signed without probing deeper. He realized that his own silence, even if justified as maintaining stability, was also part of the problem. "Elijah," Marcus said, his voice low, "suppose I agree that this is systematic fraud. What do you want from us?" Elijah did not answer immediately. He looked at each person in the room in turn, then said, "I want you to look straight at it. No softening, no delaying, no renaming." One officer shook his head slightly, his voice subdued. "If this goes outside, the consequences will be enormous." "They will be," Elijah replied, "but the consequences of continuing to remain silent are even greater." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. He knew Elijah was right. The issue was that the price to be paid was not only the reputation of a single unit, but the credibility of the entire system. Decisions like this were not made lightly, but the longer it dragged on, the higher the cost became. Elijah touched the recording device once more, expanding the data. Charts appeared, comparing reported figures with actual figures. The gap between them was not large in numerical terms, but large enough to create deadly differences under real combat conditions. "Recent training cohorts have not been trained to real conditions," he said. "Some individuals used their authority to falsify results. Many others knew, but chose silence to protect their careers and their unit's reputation." The room fell silent again. No one objected, because objecting now would mean denying what was plainly visible before their eyes. Marcus straightened. He did not speak immediately. His silence lasted long enough for everyone in the room to feel the weight of the decision about to be made. He looked at each face, registering anxiety, defensiveness, and fear. Then, he looked at Elijah, who stood there not as an accuser, but as a witness who had completed his part. "Would you choose to preserve reputation, or to preserve lives for the next generation?" The question was not spoken aloud, but it was clear in Marcus's eyes. He turned back to the desk and placed his hand on the data display, as a final gesture of acknowledgement that he had seen, had understood, and could not turn away. Marcus stood up. The chair behind him shifted slightly, making a small but distinct sound in the quiet room. He looked around, his voice firm, not raised, not emphasized. "Send the data." Those 3 words fell like a full stop on every effort at concealment. No one asked who it would be sent to. No one demanded further explanation. Everyone understood that, from this moment on, the matter had moved beyond this room, beyond the possibility of internal handling. Elijah nodded very slightly. The orange gun remained on the table, silent, but its role was complete. It had done exactly what it was created to do, forcing the truth into the open, forcing those in power to choose. Outside, the training ground was still quiet, but somewhere within the system, A wave had begun to spread, not loud, not showy, but unstoppable. The data left the training ground faster than anyone had expected. It did not pass through the familiar channels that allowed delays, adjustments, or softening. From the independent recording system mounted on the orange-colored rifle, all parameters were transmitted directly to the Ministry of Defense, accompanied by confirmation from Brigadier General Marcus. Within just a few hours, the figures that had long been buried beneath polished reports were laid out on the desks of people who had never had a reason to hide them. Less than 24 hours later, the first order was issued. A joint investigative committee was established, belonging to no single branch of the armed forces. Its composition was diverse enough that no individual unit could control the entire process. When the announcement was passed down, the corridors of the training agencies, once quiet, began to hum with a different sound, one of anxiety. The first officer summoned was the man directly responsible for evaluating sniper training results for many years. He entered the committee's office with his usual confident demeanor, carrying a thick file, his face holding the expression of someone long accustomed to giving explanations. When the first question was raised, he answered smoothly, citing procedures, standards, and recent technical improvements. "The discrepancy is due to equipment," he said firmly. "The old system has latency." Elijah was present in the room as a technical advisor. He did not sit at the center, nor did he interrupt. When the officer finished speaking, Elijah looked up, his voice low and non-confrontational. "An error repeated for 10 years. The room fell silent. The officer paused for a beat. He opened the file and flipped quickly through several pages, as if searching for a detail that might salvage the situation. Members of the committee exchanged glances. The question did not need a raised voice. It struck directly at the weakest point of the argument just presented. Comparative data was displayed on the large screen. On one side were the annual training reports. On the other were the actual figures from the independent recording system. When the two sets of data were placed side by side, the discrepancy became unmistakably clear, requiring no lengthy explanation. The degree of divergence was nearly identical across multiple cycles. It was not random. It was not a temporary fault. The summoned officer fell silent. A few seconds later, he shifted his approach. "It's possible my subordinates entered the data incorrectly," he said. "I didn't handle the input myself." Another officer, called in next, used a similar line of reasoning. He blamed the technical team, the data transfer process, and the pressure of time. Each person attempted to push responsibility down one level lower, to a place they believed the light of the investigation would not reach. Elijah listened, then methodically pointed out each anomaly. He did not raise his voice. He laid out every step of the process, from wind measurement, distance setup, and error recording, to the rounding of numbers in the final report. He identified where data had been altered, where parameters had been polished, and where technical warnings had been ignored. These details were not conjecture. They aligned perfectly with the independent data. Marcus sat at the far end of the table, observing everything. The more he listened, the more he realized something that sent a chill through him. Elijah was not merely analyzing. He was reconstructing a process that he seemed to have witnessed before. The way Elijah identified each step and each loophole made it clear that this was not the first time he had seen a system operate in this manner. "Elijah," Marcus asked, during a rare pause, "have you encountered this before?" Elijah looked at him and gave a very slight nod. 30 years ago, he said, at another training ground. The answer required no further explanation. Marcus understood that this was not a new story. It had only changed its form and its people, while keeping its essence intact. Every system tended to protect itself by polishing results. As long as no one paid an immediate price, the investigation continued relentlessly over the course of 48 hours. Old reports were revisited, line by line. Charts once regarded as evidence of success became traces of concealment. Officers once considered untouchable began to be named, not through rumor, but through official documents bearing the committee's seal. Some tried to remain calm, believing this was merely a short-term review. Others began to panic, making calls, seeking connections, trying to secure intervention. But this time, the familiar channels no longer worked. The investigative committee did not respond to after-hours messages. They worked only with data. Marcus followed every step closely. He reread decisions he himself had signed, realizing that trust in the system had caused him to overlook questions that should have been asked much earlier. Each page turned revealed another layer of responsibility. He did not shy away from it. He knew he could not. By the end of day 2, the picture was clear enough to be irreversible. A preliminary conclusion was drafted. The words appeared cold and emotionless. Systematic deviation, not individual error, not an isolated technical failure, an operational mechanism built on authority and collective silence. Marcus read the conclusion repeatedly. He did not try to soften it. He only refined the wording to make it as precise as possible. When he signed his name in confirmation, he knew that from that moment on, none of them could return to the state they had been in before. Elijah stood by the window, looking out over the empty courtyard. For him, the past 48 hours did not feel like a victory. It felt like a completed loop. Truth, once placed in the right position, would generate its own momentum. He had done his part. When the conclusion was sent out, a brief, internal notice was issued. The scope of the investigation was expanded. It was no longer limited to a single training ground, a single unit, or a single group of officers. The list under investigation grew longer, extending beyond the initial familiar names. Marcus looked at that list, then lifted his gaze. He understood that this was only the beginning. A system that had just been exposed never collapsed at only one point. It would pull other links with it, places that had believed themselves safe because no one had ever looked at them directly. And as the investigation list continued to expand, beyond a single unit, everyone understood that this story would not end within 48 hours. The decision was issued without a lengthy explanation. The entire sniper training team of that course, including Rock, was required to repeat the training program from the beginning. No protection, no exceptions, no priority. The order was signed after the preliminary investigation concluded, as cold as the very figures that had led to it. For many, it was a heavy blow to their reputation. For Rock, it was a public humiliation. On the very first day, when the assignment list was read aloud, Rock jumped to his feet. He did not hide his irritation. "I don't need to relearn this," he said loudly, his tone sharp, as if speaking on behalf of the entire room. Elijah stood at the front, one hand resting on the table, his eyes fixed on Rock. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You do," he replied simply. The room fell silent. Some people lowered their heads. Others glanced at Rock and then looked away. That form of address was not insulting. It was defining. Elijah was not speaking to Rock as a superior to a subordinate, but as someone who had seen the ending, speaking to a man walking straight toward it. The first training exercise was completely redesigned by Elijah. It did not follow the old curriculum. Familiar with daytime shooting, standard distances, and stable conditions, he chose night shooting. He chose complex terrain. He chose factors where even the smallest deviation could be amplified into severe consequences. It was the kind of exercise not meant to showcase skill, but to expose it. Night fell faster than expected. Artificial lighting was kept to an absolute minimum. Each shooter had exactly what they were permitted to carry. No one explained much. Elijah stood at the edge of the range, watching each person take position. Rock stepped forward, his shoulders tense. He was accustomed to clear light, familiar rhythms, and the feeling that he always had control of the situation. Here, everything was different. The exercise began. The night wind was unstable. It shifted direction slightly but constantly, carrying unpredictable variations. The other shooters took time to observe, to adjust, to accept that they needed to slow down. Rock did not. He trusted his experience, believed the familiar figures still applied. He misjudged the wind, the timing. He was wrong from the very first step, but he did not realize it. Elijah observed, through the spotting scope. He clearly saw the slight deviation in Rock's posture, a detail that might be overlooked in daytime shooting. But under these conditions, it became dangerous. He frowned, but did not speak yet. He wanted to see what Rock would do next. Rock pulled the trigger. The bullet left the barrel in the darkness, carrying the inertia of a hasty decision. Its trajectory deviated from the intended path not by much, but enough to enter a dangerous zone. In that brief moment, several lives stood within reach of risk. No one reacted in time except Elijah. "Stop," he shouted, his voice low but sharp. He rushed forward, immediately blocking Rock's next movement, pulling the rifle away from the firing direction. The faint sound of metal clashing echoed in the quiet night. Everyone froze. No one spoke. They understood that something had just nearly crossed a line from which there would be no return. Rock stood rigid. He looked toward the direction the bullet had traveled, then at Elijah. For the first time since he had stepped onto this range, his eyes were no longer arrogant. They wavered, confused, and revealed something else: fear. Elijah turned to face Rock. His gaze was not angry. It was cold, clear, and non-negotiable. "You're not dangerous because you shoot badly," he said evenly, without emphasis. Rock swallowed hard. He tried to say something, but his throat went dry. Elijah continued, each word falling distinctly into the night. "You're dangerous because you don't know you shoot badly." The sentence needed no further explanation. It cut straight into what Rock had relied on all this time, the illusion of his own ability, nurtured by privilege and protection. Around them, the others stood still. No one laughed. No one looked at Rock with contempt. They looked at him as they would at a living lesson. Elijah signaled for the exercise to be suspended. He ordered everyone to step back and hold their positions. He did not scold. He did not prolong the moment. He only needed that instant to be remembered, exactly for what it was. "If this were real combat," he said quietly, "we would have someone dead." Rock lowered his head. He did not argue. He did not look for excuses. He stood there, his arms hanging loose, a faint tremor running along his spine. The previous boasts, the laughter, the times his mistakes had been overlooked, all of it surfaced at once. And this time, none of it protected him. The training resumed afterward, but Rock was no longer the center. He carried out each step more slowly, more cautiously. Every time he placed his hand on the rifle, he remembered the moment the bullet had veered off course. Elijah observed from a distance, saying nothing more. For him, the lesson had been delivered. When the session ended, everyone dispersed in silence. Rock remained alone for a long while. He stared into the darkness where the bullet had passed. He understood that if Elijah had been slower by even a single beat, the consequences would not have been confined to paperwork or reports. They would have been written on human bodies. For the first time, Rock was afraid. Not afraid of superiors. Not afraid of discipline. He was afraid of himself, afraid of the blind confidence that had nearly turned him into a killer. And in the darkness of the training ground, when every illusion was stripped away by one very real moment, Rock stood still, realizing that there are mistakes that are never allowed a second chance. The decision was issued on a morning quieter than usual. There were no alarm sirens, no emergency formations, no booming command shouts, just an official notice, delivered through proper procedure, yet heavy enough to make the entire training ground pause. Rock read his name on the list, his eyes lingering longer than necessary. This time, there was no one standing behind him to revise the wording, no one pulling him aside to say that everything would turn out fine. He entered the office at the scheduled time and stood straight in front of the desk. When the door closed, Rock lowered his head. The movement was slow, not the kind of bow made out of formality. "I am not worthy," he said, his voice hoarse, not attempting to hide the obvious truth that had just been placed on his shoulders. Elijah stood opposite him. He looked at Rock for a moment, then gave a slight nod. There were no words of comfort, and no reproach. To Elijah, this moment required no further explanation. Rock's recognition of his own limits was already the greatest result any training could produce. The disciplinary decisions were announced immediately afterward. The names of many officers appeared on the list, accompanied by irreversible measures: demotion, dishonorable discharge, transfer of files to independent investigative departments. There were no exceptions, no familiar safe zones. The decisions were read aloud in an even, emotionless voice, mirroring the way the system was finally forced to confront the consequences of its own actions. The training ground was temporarily suspended from operation. The main gate was closed, and a notice board was hung with a brief message. No one protested. Those who had once viewed this place as a springboard for power now looked at it as a space that needed cleansing. Training programs were halted, plans were put on hold, yet no one dared call it a waste. The cost of continuing as before had become far too clear. New certification standards were issued quietly. There were no loud press conferences, no declarations of victory. Documents were sent down to the units, accompanied by detailed technical appendices. Within them, the orange rifle was listed as an independent certification standard for long-range shooting drills, not because it was visually distinctive, but because it represented a non-negotiable principle. Data must exist outside all chains of human intervention. The orange rifle was placed in the technical room, marked with a simple plaque. Everyone who passed by could see it. No one laughed anymore. No one asked why it was that color. It became part of the new system, a direct reminder that some things are not permitted to be distorted, whether by power or by habit. Brigadier General Marcus stood by the office window, looking out at the empty yard of the now closed training ground. He turned when he heard footsteps. Elijah stood there, his demeanor unchanged from his first appearance. calm, and carrying none of the air of someone who had just completed an overthrow. "You saved them," Marcus said, his voice low, no longer carrying the tone of command. Elijah shook his head slightly and replied softly, "I just didn't let them die." The words settled in the office like a conclusion. No one argued. Marcus understood that Elijah was not speaking about a specific unit or a specific class of soldiers. He was speaking about generations who had not yet set foot on the training ground, about those who would carry weapons under real conditions, where there would be no polished reports to shield mistakes. Rock left the elite unit at the end of the day. He carried very little with him. As he passed through the gate, he stopped and turned back for one last look at the training ground. There were no training lights, no gunfire, only the stillness of a place that had just been forced to confront itself. Rock understood that this departure was not his greatest failure. His greatest failure had been believing that he was better than reality. Elijah left not long afterward. There was no escort vehicle, no farewell ceremony. He walked out of the military zone with his familiar, unhurried gait. The orange rifle did not go with him. It stayed behind, placed exactly where it needed to be. To Elijah, carrying it any further was unnecessary. It had fulfilled its role. The story did not end at the training ground fence. Internal reports were shared with other certification departments. Questions began to be raised in places that had once believed themselves safe, not because one person spoke up, but because the data existed, and data, once released, does not care about reputation or rank. If you believe that truth should not be bent by power, share this story. Elijah walked on, blending into the flow of people outside the military zone like any other ordinary person. No one recognized him. No one called his name. That did not matter. What mattered was that, left behind, the orange rifle still lay there, silent, ready to record any bullet that might fly in the future. And somewhere else, in another system, at another training ground, where polished numbers are being trusted far too easily, a sense of unease begins to spread. No one knows exactly when it will erupt, but they know one thing: the truth, once it has found its trajectory, will not stop halfway. This story is not about a 4,000-meter shot. It is about beautified numbers, about silence disguised under more pleasant names, and about the price others pay when deviations are treated as trivial. The orange rifle does not remain to become a legend. It remains as a reminder that in any system, the truth always exists, no matter how long it has been covered up. If you believe that power should never stand above human lives, if you believe that truth does not need permission to exist, follow and subscribe to the channel. Stories like these are not told merely for entertainment. They are told to force us to look straight ahead, even when it is uncomfortable. And in the following episodes, we will continue to open other stories, where a small choice, or a single moment of silence, can decide who lives and who pays the price. So press follow and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the stories that come next.